Thank you. Right. In fact, we were discussing the money supply process in our last lecture, and effectively we are carrying forward from where we stopped. But interestingly, you would have clearly recognized the liability side and the asset side with respect to the central banks, and then of course with respect to, let's say, a commercial bank. But when it comes to understanding, it is very comfortable and easy if you first look at it from a central bank perspective, and you will see always in the central bank books, if you look at the liabilities in the form of currency in circulation and reserves, and also in the asset side, the securities and loans to financial institutions. And this turnaround when it comes to a commercial bank balance sheet. So we were trying to kind of see the influence to these elements through open market operation, both purchase as well as a sale in our last discussion. And then we were trying to kind of, effectively looking at the influence to both reserves and currency in circulation and securities, and then of course the loans that the central bank extend, and through which what happens to the so-called high-powered money. Okay, so high-powered money, we discussed that and we looked at it in terms of what is high-powered money, or in other words, monetary base, where it's comprised of both C and R, currency in circulation, and reserves in the sense the total reserves in the banking system, right? So then we looked at this and expanded with open market activities and trying to kind of reach out to a point where we wanted to see what other factors, okay, what other factors apart from the open market activities that could also influence the money supply in an economy, right? So this is where we stopped, and we will continue from this point onwards. And interestingly, we will try to discuss these elements and try to finish off the course in today's discussion. And I leave a special note with the IBSL in terms of concentrating on areas that we have covered. Of course, a few areas we couldn't get into, especially because of these exceptional circumstances, but we'll try to kind of work through and try to communicate. I have already done, but I'll again repeat it with the IBSL to focus on areas that we have discussed up to now. So the apart from open market related discussion that we had, the float, I briefly touched upon this also, but what it is the possibility that the delays in processing of financial instructions between financial intermediaries, because of this, that could get counted in both sides of the equation, right? The party who is paying as well as party who is receiving. So in such circumstances, this float also influence the overall money supply. But in today's financial market, there are a number of ways through which you could address this type of elements. One is, the gross settlement process versus net settlement process, right? So gross settlement process is if you have entered to a transaction with, let's say, Bank B, and then Bank B also entered the transaction with you, right? So you first direct your financial transaction with Bank B, let's say 100 million, you settle it. The bank B also entered the transaction with you separately as 75 million. The bank B also settled that transaction for 75 million. So it moves 100 million from you and then another 75 million from the bank B to you. But when it comes to net settlement, you look at 100 million you have to pay, 75 million you have to receive. So what you are basically settling is only 25 million that you have to pay. So that would take out the possibility, the funds in transit, like movements in funds being minimized, and also that is the one element where the risk also substantively reduced in financial markets, where the requirement on your part is only 25 million, not 100 million in the first place. Okay, so that is not only reduce the risk, but also reduce the transaction cost, because you had to pay. And I just took example between two, that if you take a financial intermediary, you have thousands of transactions with another counterparty, and similar thousands of transactions with another list of counterparties. So it's crisscrossing against each other. Okay, so then treasury deposits, that is government deposits with the central bank. So government deposits means government's money, means the currency in circulation, effectively what is in the economy. When they deposit this with the central bank, by that amount, the entire money stock available in the economy get reduced. Okay, so then the intervention in the foreign exchange market, these are like sterilized, non-sterilized. I was mentioning this also. What you mean by foreign exchange market intervention is the central banks all around the world participate in foreign exchange purchases as well as foreign exchange sales. Through foreign exchange purchases, you inject domestic currency into the economy. So you buy foreign currency into the central bank books and pay off currency in circulation. That means new currency being, domestic currency being supplied to the economy. Similarly, foreign exchange sale, central banks sell foreign exchange, and the domestic currency that is in circulation in the economy now get absorbed or come into the central bank's books. By that amount, then overall money supply reduces, or the monetary base reduces, right? Because currency in circulation reduces. So then what happened is this also affect the overall monetary base position. So then central banks just leave it as what they have done in the foreign exchange market refers to non-sterilized foreign exchange market transaction. Because of foreign exchange market transaction, the influence to the domestic money supply or monetary base has not been reversed by the central bank. You let it. Okay, that happened, that's done. But sterilized transaction means you nullify the impact of such foreign exchange market intervention. I said central banks sell foreign exchange. By that amount, liquidity get reduced because domestic currency come into the central bank from circulation or from reserves. The monetary base get reduced, right? So when that happens, you do a corresponding open market operations like purchase of securities in the market. So central bank get the security, a similar amount is channeled or injected to the economy by open market action. So that would sterilize, nullify the impact of foreign exchange market transaction that we discussed. Okay, so we see this. And then we are coming to the point where the ability of the monetary authority or the central bank to control the monetary base. So open market operations that they do, central banks do, based on their ability, the willingness, what they wanted to do, it's simply under their control. So open market operation is concerned, central bank has full control over its influence on money supply or the monetary base. But then the another element where the loans requested by the banks, Okay, that means the borrowing by banks from the central bank, liquidity facility, lender of last resort facility, discount windows. There are various elements. But effectively, the controlling ability of this is not with the central bank. It is a decision by the banks to borrow from central bank. So it's a decision by them. So if you are trying to control the money supply in the economy through lending arrangements, your ability to control that is limited because it's a decision by the banks, not by the central bank itself. But open market operation is actually fully under the central bank's control, and they could actually inject, actually absorb, depends on your open market objectives. So then you look at the monetary base. You already know the monetary base have the so-called reserves component, currency in circulation plus R, that is reserves. So what you are basically seeing in this monetary base is there's a component called borrowed reserves. That is the banks borrowing from the central bank. So that is borrowed. So you can now separate so-called monetary base by taking out this borrowed component, and you can call it monetary base non-borrowed. Because this borrowed component, to some extent, not necessarily a permanent component in the monetary base, because it's something most of the banks received as borrowing from the central bank. So central bank expects these banks to honor, and if not, they have other mechanisms to follow. But at different times, these borrowed reserves also more or less becomes like a permanent resource in the economy, especially during financial crisis periods. Okay, but interestingly, what you have to see is reserves, whether it is borrowed or non-borrowed, that is positively related to money supply. Okay, so whether you borrow from the central bank or you have your reserves base, any increase in borrowed or non-borrowed have a positive influence to the money supply. So this is another element that you have to kind of look at it in terms of the controlling ability of the central bank in terms of its activities to influence the money supply. Open market operation, it has full control of the central bank, whereas the lending windows, that has a discretionary element where the banks have the discretion. So the central bank would not have the full control with respect to the borrowed element. And the reserves, you see, that component has borrowed element and non-borrowed element. Either way, that has a positive influence over the money supply. Then there is another simple money supply proposition, that is a multiple deposit creation, right? This is a simple, straightforward model where you probably see, right, when somebody gets money, if not, let's assume that one person is selling securities, right? We have seen this in the central bank books, where the central bank has absorbed the books, absorbed the securities, right? And then they created the reserves on behalf of that particular bank where they purchase those securities. So what you basically see is security side of the bank got reduced by 100, right? And then the reserve side of the bank increased by 100 because on behalf of this particular bank, central bank has created the reserves. So you have seen the asset side increased by 100. Securities reduced because that securities has gone to the central bank's books, because you have sold it to the central bank. So you see here the first National Bank securities reduced, but reserves have correspondingly increased. So when you see this reserves is, and you know, is somebody, general public, who sold. The security belongs to that general public. You know all that we discussed in our last discussion. So effectively, these reserves that now held in First National Bank's book is somebody's, not that First National Bank. So that means you have to effectively create a deposit in the name of that individual. So you create a, let's say, checkable deposit, not fixed deposit, checkable. This you can withdraw at any time. So you have seen 100 million you created on behalf of this particular individual. This particular individual, when you create that 100 million, effectively that also facilitate, right? You can loan these funds to any new party until such time this individual withdraw this money. Okay, he can withdraw this at will. Now itself he can come and take, or he can keep that until any time. So until you see that adjustment happens, you can create a loan up to that amount of deposits with the bank. So that's why you see loans also build up. But effectively what you are seeing from this process is you end up by having the liabilities and the assets of reserves and checkable deposits. So you have basically reduced the securities in your books and you have created a new loan of 100 million. Right? But what you are basically looking at here is, now we don't know what is the required reserve ratio the central banks impose on banks' deposits. So then you are required to maintain that amount with the central bank. Until such time, everything that you have kept is, or you have kept over and above that requirement, become excess reserves. Okay. So we are basically looking at that process until such time you really see the process in which the share of the reserves required by the banks to be maintained at the central bank as a part of the deposits that you have created. If you kept everything as reserves, that becomes excess by substantive amount, because central banks would only ask a smaller share, if not a quantity, being kept as resource with them, and the balance entirety you have make use of your business model, right? Now we come to a little more descriptive explanation here, right? So what you are now seeing is checkable deposits and reserves in the first place. First National Bank, we just say Bank A. Okay, resource being created. In the previous slide also you have seen this position. Then you see checkable deposits being created. Okay, from the checkable deposits, now you assume the required reserves. That means SRR in Sri Lankan parlance, statutory reserve ratio. SRR is nothing but statutory reserve ratio that banks need to keep as deposits with the central bank. So any deposits banks build out of that deposit, that percentage of statutory reserve ratio imposed by the central bank has to be kept as reserves. Okay, this ratio, so-called percentage, changes time to time. If a statutory reserve ratio is 10%, out of a checkable deposit of 100, you have to keep 1 out of 10 of the checkable deposit, or in other words, 10% of 100 million as your required reserves. So that's what central bank has now shown in it. The bank has shown in its book, where he has effectively required to keep how much? $10 out of $100 million checkable deposit they have created. And if this statutory reserve ratio, let's say, reduces to 5%, then how much they have to keep? It is $5 million out of 100 million deposits. Okay. Then the balance, when you keep 10 at 10% statutory reserve ratio, the balance 90 million is available for you to loan it to another customer. Okay. You can loan it to another customer. If it is 5% statutory reserve ratio, then you will be having 95 million to loan it to another customer. So you are again seeing this has expanded to the next point. Then that when you loan it to another customer, bank is providing a loan. Let's say you got a loan from the bank. Bank would not give you the entire money to your hand. What bank does is create an account with them in your name and deposit that amount. They have loaned you 90 million. Immediately they have created you 90 million checkable deposits. But these checkable deposits, effectively, until such time you start making use of this money, is basically sitting as reserves 90. Then you know what the reserve that you have to keep with the central bank at 10% statutory reserve ratio. Then out of 90, 10% is 9. So effectively, you have to keep 9 in reserves out of 90 checkable deposits, and the balance 81, you can now loan it for another customer. So you can go on like this until you find that there is no balance left in this process. So you can see from an original single deposits of 100 million, you can continuously create new deposits with you only by keeping the required reserve. And if this required reserve ratio is large, the amount of deposits, multiple deposits that you can create get reduced. When this required reserve ratio is small, as I was mentioning 5%, the number of times you can create these multiple deposits become many times, that means large, and you can go on and increase the money supply in this process. So you can see this process in a very straightforward tabulated form here, where you see the bank has basically used the original $100 million deposits and then looked at it with a 10% so-called reserve requirement. Okay, so 100 and 10% reserve requirement. So you know originally when you loan entire 100, right, the deposits has now created immediately for that loan that you have created. And then at 10%, you have the reserves, that is the last column, right? That is 10 million. And then you are left with 90. So then you loan that 90, another deposit is created for 90. 10% of 90 is 9 million. So you left with 81, that is now loaned, and that loan has become another deposits of another customer. 10% of that is 8.1 million. So when you take out that required reserve at 10% of $81 million, that is 8.1, you are left with 72.9 million as new loans that you can create. So you loaned it, you are created a deposit for that loan also. From that loan, 72.9, 10% requirement is 7.29 that you have kept as a reserves in the central bank. Then you are left with another 65.61 million. You loaned it, you create a deposit, and then 10% of that deposit is 6.56. The balance is 59.05. And you create a deposit, 10% of 59.05 is 5.91. And then you are left with 51.14. Likewise, you can go on until this, right, loan balance reaches effectively zero, where you cannot create furthermore deposits. So if you look at all this, you can go on this and you can do as an experiment, fill the kind of, points below F here and see, you will end up to the point where the value is zero, and aggregate them and see. You will be able to see increase in deposits by 1,000 at 10% for $100 million original deposit. And then the loans also you will probably see equal to that deposits that you have created, because you are basically creating a loan and converting that into a deposits. And then you will see the aggregate of that new deposits created in the form of reserves is 100 million. That is 10% of 1,000 again. So this is the general process that you see in banks in the form of multiple deposit creation. And you change this 10% to 5% and do this exercise. This is very easy. If you have Excel sheet in the computer, you can just plug these numbers and drag on. You can easily kind of see where it hits the zero value. But one thing that you will be understanding here is, this is a process which depends on number of factors. We will come to that point, but you first see deriving this so-called multiple deposit formula, simple multiple deposit formula. Okay, so in this exercise, as I said, there is some elements that matters. You have seen that at all times, reserves that the bank has kept is only the 10% of the deposit. That means only the statutory reserve requirement, not anything more. For 100, it is 10. For 90, it is 9. For 81, it is 8.1. 10% of the deposit. That means in the exercise that we have done in the multiple deposit creation, the entirety of that operation was work on the basis of that the banks do not hold any excess reserves. Not a single cent being kept as excess reserves. We assume that the process just follows with only the required reserve. So in such circumstance, so-called required reserves in the economy, RR, is nothing but equals to total reserves. Okay, so there's assumption that you have mentioned that no excess reserves in this exercise. 1 second, please. Anyway, so we were basically taking out the so-called excess reserve possibility in the economy in this simple multiple deposit creation model. So you come to the conclusion where you basically sets the total reserves in the economy as required reserves. Okay, so that's how we are working in the simple multiple deposit creation exercise. So what you are basically seeing here is required reserve at any given point of time is nothing but the so-called reserve ratio times the deposits, checkable deposit. So you call it any other name, fine. But simple required reserves, RR, is nothing but small r, that is required reserve ratio times the checkable deposits, D. Right? So you basically write down the equation where required reserves equals total reserves is nothing but total reserves equals simple R times D, reserve ratio times deposits. Dividing both sides by small r, what you are doing here is, right, you are creating a kind of a circumstance where the deposits are left hand side of the equation. When you divide that by r, small r, so small r to small r get cancelled out, so you left with only D, that is deposits, equal 1 over small r ratio times r, that is total reserves. Okay, taking the change in both sides of the equation, change in deposits, change in reserves, you can basically set what's the economy's possibility of multiple deposit creation by looking at this particular a small r in the equation. So we are basically exercising this small, if not multiple deposit creation model by taking the economy's possibility of maintaining excess reserves out. So you basically looked at all this and you have come to the assumption there's no excess reserves in the economy. So the total reserves are always equal to the required reserves. So the required reserves is at any given point of time nothing but the ratio times the deposits. So you basically replaced it with the equation, and this is very straightforward. You can understand it, but what you have to understand more than this is only a hypothetical model. In reality, there's critics for this simple model because the simple model doesn't exist in reality. Why? In the first place, right? In the first place, we have assumed you create a deposit, checkable deposit, right? And the customer would not withdraw any money in the account. So as soon as you take out money from the deposits by that amount, the next round where you go for new deposit creation, after keeping for the required reserve, the equation get reduced by the amount of cash that you hold. So what the model straight away suggests is holding cash, stop this process. If you basically say entire 90 you have kept in cash, no deposits there, then you can't go beyond that first step itself. So in reality, the model is assumption driven and have number of difficulties to smoothly flow down to the completion of the full cycle that you can create without any interruption. First interruption is holding cash. That stops the process. The second point is, okay, banks may not use all their excess reserves to buy securities or make loans. Right? At any given point of time, everything you had in this exercise as excess reserves in the central bank books, you have taken out and put them as a new loan. Only kept the required reserves. The balance you created as a new loan. You make loans or from another perspective to buy securities. No. Okay. So this is hypothetical. You might not necessarily see banks may not use all their excess reserves in an equation. Okay. And that effectively say banks are always keeping an additional reserve over and above required reserves. For instance, if it is 10 and it is $10 million at 10%, bank would effectively seeing in a real sense, keeping additional 1 or 2% most of the time as excess reserves. That's a kind of a general practice you might see across different market circumstances. And then depositors' decision, how much currency to hold. You know, holding currency will break down the equation. So it's a decision by depositors, not by you lend the bank lend the loan, okay, but the depositor knows how much to keep. It's a decision by him. Okay, and other side is similarly the bank's decision is how much to keep in excess. If you are a risk-averse bank and you are worried about your liquidity position going forward, you will keep a higher excess reserves. That would cause your money supply to change by significant amount because you will not be able to create multiple deposits. Right? So these are the critics that you find in the simple model. Okay, so we are now moving into a much more a complete circumstance of a kind of a money supply model. You will see here changes in the non-borrowed monetary base and then changes in borrowed reserves. So this is that we have looked at from another perspective in our discussion where we said reserves are either borrowed or non-borrowed. Okay, and you already know both borrowed and non-borrowed are positively related to the monetary base. Okay, so we assume and we understand that, we keep that in our thinking, and we move on to further elaborate this point in our discussion. Right? Any questions? Okay, so you see here you have borrowed and non-borrowed, both are positive. Then apart from those two factors that determine the money supply, positively determine the money supply, you also know other elements like changes in the required reserve ratio. But here, the required reserve ratio are negatively related to the money supply. If you increase the required reserve ratio by that amount, the amount, not only the amount, but by that possibility, the cycles of multiple deposit creation get reduced. So the required reserve ratio increased from 10 to 20, basically reduced by half the possibility of multiple deposit creation. You must have seen in terms of simple deposit creation model. Right? So similarly, changes in currency holding, that also negatively related to the money supply. Higher the money that you hold in currency form, that means not in deposit form, by that amount, the deposit creation reduces. So that also negatively related to the money supply. Then the excess reserves, right? So you know it's precautionary. The banks keep part of their deposits as excess reserves in the central bank's books. Not all amount, the full amount. Yes, they make use of them to make new loans and then invest and take business activities, fine. But over and above the required reserves, you keep a smaller share in excess reserves form. Increase in excess reserves, reduce the money supply probabilities. So what you are basically seeing is factors that determine money supply positively and factors that determine money supply in terms of its relationship negatively. So all reserve ratios, currency holdings, excess reserves are negatively related, whereas borrowed as well as non-borrowed are positively related. So everything being focused, okay, this chart again shows you the direction of the change in variable, all is increasing, its impact to the money supply, right? When the borrowed as well as non-borrowed, you see money supply is increasing. Whereas required reserve ratio, when it increased, excess reserves, when it increased, the currency holdings, when it increased, money supply is decreased. So reasons also very clear when it comes to non-borrowed, more monetary base for deposit creation, whereas required reserves, less multiple deposit expansion. We discussed these things. But for your easy understanding, now you see this being presented and highlighted in this exercise. Right. So we will come to another interesting component. This is called multiplier, money multiplier. Okay. So when it comes to money multiplier, right, which is the amount of money that banks generate with each unit of reserves. Okay, so reserve is the amount of deposits that the central banks requires. Federal Reserve is US Central Bank. Okay, central bank requires banks to hold and not lend. You know that if it is 10% out of each 100 rupees of deposits, you have to keep 10% with the central bank. You can't lend that. Okay, so this bank reserves is the ratio of reserves to the total amount of deposits. You know that, small r time D, that is the required reserves. Okay, so then for easy understanding here, define money as currency plus checkable deposits. Checkable deposits is almost currency. You can immediately check it. You can take it, you can withdraw it, you can pay it, all kind of things. And we simply call it money as both currency and, because these are highly liquid in terms of, so it's almost money. So then you know money supply, that's big M, is nothing but monetary base times the multiplier. So we will try to now build this so-called small m. So by looking at this small m, then for a given monetary base size, you can basically arrive at the economy's M1, if not big M, money supply, which is money in the form of currency and checkable deposits. And this would be a main driver in all economic activities, right? So we will see that process by deriving this money multiplier by taking few aspects. You already know reserve ratio, that is small r. Okay, so you know what this small r is. That is the amount of reserves, okay, share of deposits that you have to keep with the central bank as reserves, and the reserve ratio is negatively related to the money supply. Okay, and then you now look at so-called desired holding of currency, which is big C, and excess reserves, that is, we call it ER for the time being, and you know these things are correlated, proportionally correlated to checkable deposits D. That means when the D checkable deposits increases in an economy, you probably see the currency holdings also increases. Similarly, excess reserves also grow, right? So this is very common through empirical studies that has been established. Any economy, when it increases its deposit base, you also find your currency holdings also increases, because your income has gone up in the first place to increase both currency holdings and checkable deposits. Banks also then increase its holding of some excess reserves simply because the economic activities expands, and you probably require something over and above your required reserve for unforeseen possibilities. But you now come to a point where you try to define what is this small c, that is currency ratio. How much of currency you want to keep from your deposits, that is the currency ratio. So you take, you have a deposits of 1 million and you hold currencies of 200,000. So 200,000 over 1 million. So then that is the small c. So what is the small c here is currency ratio. So 200 over 1 million, that is in effectively 1,000 here. That is like 1/5 you maintain as currency ratio. That means 20%. Okay. So when you have a deposits of 1 million, if you know the 20%, you can immediately say what is the currency held in the economy, that is 200,000. So I just got a very simple example for you to understand. So like you, there may be hundreds of thousands people. By looking at all these things, there's a kind of a general average the economies have from their empirical business cycle development over number of years. But this currency ratios changes with economic circumstances. When the pandemics happen, when the New Year period happens, right? When you see future is uncertain, election times, the currency held by people increases. Currency in circulation increases because your requirements increases during that period, or you become precautionary. Precautionary motive drives you to keep higher volume in currency form, highly liquid form. So in such circumstances, small c that you are referring is higher in general economic, empirical economic experiences. Then you see excess reserves. That also nothing but the amount that you keep in reserve form over and above the required reserves out of your deposit stock. If you keep excess reserves, let's say 20 out of 1 million, you probably see right? 20 out of 1 million, 100 out of 1 million is 10. 20 out of 1 million is 1/10 of a share. That is nothing but 2%, right? So excess reserve, small e also, interestingly, a volatile that depends on the economic circumstances. If the economy is not necessarily functioning, or the banks are to some extent risk averse, they keep more excess reserves. So that drives higher small e in economics. But you have to just get a kind of a feel here that small c and small e. That's what important for us for the time being, right? So then you move to the point where money multiplier that we are trying to derive here. And we already know in the simple model, we have assumed that there is no excess reserves. But in reality, you know, the economy, all the economies carries both required reserves plus excess reserves. So instead of equaling R, total reserves, to required reserves, as in the simple model, we are now looking at required reserves plus excess reserves as the total reserves in an economy. You cannot ignore excess reserves. The banks keep excess reserves for various purposes. Economies also warrant excess reserves for various purposes. This may not be that big. It may not be zero. It may be a smaller amount based on the circumstance of the economy. Okay, so the total amount of required reserves equals the required reserve ratio times the deposits. You know that already. Required reserves are nothing but required reserve ratio times the deposit. Okay, then you see substituting required reserves in the original equation, where we have mentioned R, total reserves, as required reserves plus excess reserves. And you know required reserves is R times D. Now you are substituting R times D for required reserves. So then you can write the reserves, total reserves in the economy, as small r times D plus ER, excess reserves. And this small r, right, is sets as less than 1 at all the times. Why? If it is 1 times D is reserves, then there will be no money left with banks to do any activities in their books. All deposits you have to keep as reserves. Entirety of reserves. So this R, small r, is less than 1 all the time. Okay, but it's very close to 0. Most of the time, the banks, central banks, sets this required reserve ratio very close to lower side, not the full 100% side. So that's what it means from small r is less than 1, because you cannot have a 1 as small r. If you keep like that, the entirety of deposits you need to keep in the reserve form. So then there's no excess reserves also in the economy, because you have learned here small e that you will come to now developing is nothing but excess reserves over deposits, right? So then you see here, you already learned basics where the monetary base is nothing but C plus R. You know C, now you defined R in the previous slide as small r times T, that is required reserves plus excess reserves, ER. So you have rewritten the monetary base equation C plus R. You are still maintaining C, and then for R, you replace with reserves equal reserve ratio times deposits, that is the required reserve ratio component, plus excess reserve in this model now. Okay, so equation reveals the amount of monetary base needed to support existing amount of checkable deposits, currency, and excess reserves. So this basically says, okay, monetary base needed to support a existing amount of checkable deposits, currency, and excess reserves in an economy, right? So you are moving on. Now you know currency, small c currency ratio is nothing but C over D. So then what is C? C is nothing but small c times D. From deposits, how much you keep as currency? That is small c. And small e, that is excess reserve ratio. So excess reserves are nothing but excess reserves over deposits. So you are basically seeing is small e times deposits. That's the ratio time deposits. That's the excess reserve. So now you try to substitute this in the previous equation, right? You have written like what C plus, let's see, C plus R times D plus ER. Okay, so now you are here, you are basically maintaining R times D, that is required reserves, plus E times D, that is excess reserves, and then you see C times, small c times D, that is currency. So you take the D out, that is common for all three variables. I'll repeat this again. You have substituted in place of C, right? What is C is C, small c, that is currency ratio times deposits. Then you had in the original equation small r, that is required reserve ratio times D. It was there, that is required reserves, plus in place of excess reserves, ER, you replace now with excess reserve ratio, that is small e times deposits. So taking out D, that is the common factor of the equation, you are left with small r, that is required reserve ratio, plus small e, that is excess reserve ratio, plus small c, that is currency ratio, all things to deposits. Okay, so monetary base is nothing but small r plus small e plus small c times the deposits, right? So then you divide both sides by the term in parenthesis. So if you divide the left side where monetary base, MB is there, you will get 1 over R plus E plus C. You don't have anything to cancel it off. And the right-hand side, you already have R plus E plus C. Again, you divide by the same, that's cancel off, and only D left with. So D is nothing but 1 over R plus E plus C times monetary base. So you already know, right? M as checkable deposits plus currency. We define M1, you remember? Okay. So then you know what is C is. C is small c times deposits. So you replace C now with C small c times D, take out D, that is 1 plus C times D. Substituting this 1 plus C times D into the equation, right? Okay. So you basically see M as now 1 plus C over, that is 1 plus currency ratio over required reserve ratio plus excess reserve ratio plus currency ratio times monetary base. So what you are basically arriving at this point here is money supply is nothing but money multiplier small m times monetary base. What is the money multiplier is 1 over C, 1 plus small c currency ratio over small r, small e, small c. So money multiplier is this. So when you see in any time in the economy, when the currency holdings increases, C increases, small c increases, people become seasonal requirement, you have to hold more currency. So this 1 plus c increases and denominator also, this is numerator, this is denominator, this also increases, here also c increases. So adjustment here, right, in such circumstances, this increase in this would weigh down the entirety of small m. Multiplier would reduce. But if you simply see this R increase in R, required reserve ratio, increase in excess reserve ratio would entirely pull down your money multiplier. So economy's multipliers reduces when the economy's required reserve ratio, excess reserve ratios increases. And there are empirical evidence to that effect. We will come and show that. And we will show you why with a huge amount of money being injected to economies are not necessarily taking those money to engage in economic activities, because everything that you injected has ended up as excess reserves. Various reasons, right? You will see that. We will come to that, but before that, you can see this small example that will help you to understand what we were talking all this time. So small r required reserve ratio, just assume as 0.1. We said small r being kept as less than 1. Small r is 10 here, means 10%. 0.1 means it's 10%. Okay. So what you mean by small r, if you know a deposit base, let's say 800, and required reserve ratio is 10%. So what is the amount of required reserves in the economy is 80. Okay. So you are looking at that, and then you see currency in circulation, that is 400. And the checkable deposits, the deposit stock in the economy is 800. Okay, all billions of dollars. The excess reserves, that also given, is only 0.8 billion, less than 1 billion in this economy. Normally, the excess reserves are like that. It's not huge amount. Okay, I said required reserve ratio is 0.1, that is 10%. So if you look at that with the checkable deposits, you can calculate required reserves of 80 billion. And then with the excess reserves of 0.8 billion, this economy has total reserves of 80.8 billion. You can calculate that. Then the money supply, you know, C plus D. We discussed that. C is 400, D is 800. So C plus D is 1,200 billion. And now you know currency in circulation, that is 400 over D. Small c you can derive. What is small c is C over D. You had all this in previous slides, all these equations. So small c, 400 over 800, it's nothing but 0.5. That means 50%. So half of the deposits being kept as currency in circulation in this exercise, and therefore currency ratio is 0.5. The excess resource already given, 0.8 billion. So 0.8 billion excess reserves over deposits, that is 800 billion. Then you can derive what is small e also. Small e is 0.001. This is not even 1%. This is only 1%, sorry. Yes, 0.8 of 800. 10 of 800 is 80. 1 of 800 is 0.8. Okay, so you see all required information you can derive. So you can now put this 1 plus C, which is nothing but 1 plus 0.5 over small r, that is 0.1, that is given already. Then small e, that is 0.001 plus c, small c, that is 0.5. So 1.5 at the top numerator, denominator, which is 0.601. So if you basically divide this, the money multiplier here in this economy is 2.5 times. So if the monetary base is 1 billion, right, money supply would be at this 2.5 times multiplier would be 2.5 times 1 billion. So it is 2.5 billion in that sense. Okay, so you should be able to interpret now by changing this component. Instead of 0.5, you make this 0.6. So this answer will become 1.6. And denominator also now become 0.6 here. So what this means is, right, this become 0.71 over 1.6. So 0.71 would drag down this 2.5 substantively. It would be lower than 2.5, although this increase here as well as here. And then here, change this 0.1 to 0.2. See that. Multiplier will decrease. Increase this to another number from 0.001. This will drag down. That means the multiplier will become lower. So this is definitely less than the simple deposit multiplier. You experience in the simple deposit multiplier, it was 10 times. Deposit increases by 10 times in that exercise to increase the money supply. Okay, there are multiple expansion in deposit cases, but there is no such expansion in currency. So that's why the multiplier shows a more realistic a multiplier possibility in money supply equations. Okay, then you see the application of this two circumstances. In 1930-33, we discuss about so-called Great Depression. Okay, we will see what happened there. The bank failures, you know, they are in that period when we were discussing all these problems during financial crisis, right? There was no deposit insurance. So the bank failures were very common at that point of time. Where when a bank failure happened, immediately you have seen in such economies increase in deposit outflows and holding of currency. That means small c increases, D also decreases in that circumstances. And also in that period, excess reserve, small e also increased. So for a relatively constant monetary base, if all this, what's this, small c, small e, which are increasing, and small c also taking out currency means deposits also decreasing, the money supply decrease in the depression, Great Depression period because of the money multiplier declining, right? So you see that in the Great Depression period. This is how it's been reflected, right? And in deposits during this period has come down. You can see from start of the banking crisis, and then the deposits have really come down during this period, and then gradually built back. But then, of course, it's not one directional. It is zigzagging all throughout during this Great Depression period in deposits in the US, for your information. Then you see during this period, where's the excess reserves and currency ratios, right? Currency ratio is in the blue chart, where you see the currency holdings at the beginning, if not prior to the Great Depression, was about 20%. But this has increased to almost 40% at the peak. And of course, by the time of ending of the crisis, was closer to about 35, not 32%, as per the empirical evidence. Then excess reserves, which are almost flat, zero, but that is increasing to about 0.05, about 5%, from almost nothing to about 5%. So what basically this says is, this will drag down the multiplier, and as a result, money supply reduced, shrank in US during the period of Great Depression. And then you see here the monetary base, the black line, effectively reasonably stable, a slight increase, yes, but money supply has reduced because of multiplier. You know what is M1? Small m times monetary base. So small m reduced significantly to bring down the money supply during the Great Depression. And we will see the same example in terms of recent financial crisis. That is subprime-led 2008-9, 2007-9 period. Okay, we discuss all this in great details. Now you are applying your knowledge to see all what you have studied in now with respect to money supply behavior. During the recent financial crisis, monetary base actually tripled because of number of measures, money injection in the form of quantitative easing, asset buying, right, relief measures. We discuss all this. It's tripled, okay? And what you are basically seeing here is the currency ratio and excess reserve ratio also been seen. The currency ratio fell somewhat. In the 1929 Great Depression, you have seen currency ratio really increased. People were worried, banks were failing, people were pulling out their deposits. But now, not that significantly worried to take the money out from your deposits because you have deposit insurance. Okay, and effectively currency ratio fell. A money supply model suggests would raise the money multiplier. Okay, when the denominators small c, instead of increasing, decreasing, money multiplier would be increased if you see the model itself. Okay, right? What you are simply seeing is declining in this C were entirely offset by then significantly higher excess reserves because everybody was keeping all additional expansion in monetary base in excess reserve form during the recent crisis, simply because they haven't had much opportunities to invest and make use of this excess reserve, the monetary base expansion in economic activities. Banks were mainly keeping them in excess reserves form. So that was not necessarily working in the economy. So we will see these numbers here, the monetary base from about 700 levels have gone closer to 2 trillion level. So it is tripled. But money supply M1, C plus D that we were talking about has reasonably stuck around 1.5, 1.6 level. Not necessarily increased despite monetary base is significantly increasing. That means the multiplier would have reduced. How it has reduced? Because simple E, excess reserves. Here you see excess reserves, the blue line, almost from nothing. Almost from nothing, from zero, was almost hitting the roof, hitting well above 1%. And then the currency ratio, which remained reasonably static but somewhat reduced in the latter part of the financial crisis. So people also not worried to keep money in their money in currency form. In 1920, the behavior was completely opposite, right? So interestingly, you can see the application here in terms of recent financial crisis versus 1929's Great Depression, where the behavior of financial markets were drastically opposite. And now you know what exactly the reasons are. These last few slides that you are seeing here are little more details, right? So I'm not trying to explain this, but for your simple reading, you can use them. And this also same, right? So this you can read, same thing I was describing all throughout, right? But interestingly, you have now come to a point where you have studied a very interesting subject, which will now give you the opportunity to apply your knowledge, not only in terms of meeting your examination obligations. That's very good. You can apply them and try to see how best you can get through the examination barrier immediately. But at the same time, use this knowledge for you to gain, apply, and also practice some of these elements and understand what's exactly happening in financial markets. That would help you immensely going forward. And I have already mentioned that the focus in terms of what you have covered during this program would be the message that I have given to IBSL in terms of communicated to the examiners. So please go through some of the past papers, and I'm not sure whether there is a support session to discuss some of the past papers. Normally, I don't have time to follow them, but I request Mr. Janaked Singh, he's doing the Sinhala class, to also cover some of these elements. But by yourself, by looking at past papers, you can do some exercises and see answering to this. That would be very helpful. So with that small note, it's very unfortunate that I have not met most of you all, but I hope I will get opportunity to see you at a different point in your future. And I wish all of you all the very best, not only for the examination, but also in terms of your career and other engagements in terms of learning and career advancement. So with that, I will stop this program and wish you all well the very best once again, and stay safe. So that's my message. And if you have anything, you can pass on to me. I will see that. But it's very unfortunate that we didn't get a chance to meet and kind of go through some of this in a very lovely discussion mode that I always prefer, but unfortunately circumstance not warranting. Thank you.